Hey guys, welcome back to another journey through the dusty corridors of time. Tonight, we're going to unravel the tangled, tense, and utterly fascinating story of two of the most controversial names in global headlines, Iran and Israel. But forget the politics for now. We're going to whisper through the centuries, slowly and gently, peeling back thousands of years of belief, betrayal, prophecy, and power. Whether you're listening to sleep, to study, or just to understand, I promise you, this one's worth the ride. If you're looking for a calming and thought-provoking historical story to carry you off to dreamland, you've come to the right place. Before we begin our journey back in time, I'd love to know where in the world you're re-listening from and what time of day it is for you right now. Feel free to leave a comment and say hello. And if you enjoy this type of relaxing educational content, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. Alright, let's set the stage, shall we? Long before Iran and Israel became headlines and hashtags, they were dreams in the minds of desert wanderers, nomadic tribes, and conquering kings. Our story begins not in modern Tehran or Jerusalem, but in the soft cradle of the ancient world, where mighty rivers fed early civilizations and the gods still walked among mortals. Around 3000 BCE, a people known as the Elamites began building a kingdom in what is now southwestern Iran. Their cities, like Susa, were hubs of trade, religion, and power. At the same time, further west, the land of Canaan was taking shape, a patchwork of small city-states and tribal cultures along the eastern Mediterranean, nestled between Egypt and Mesopotamia. These weren't yet the Iran and Israel we know today, but the seeds had been planted. To the east, the Elamites were soon absorbed into a growing empire that would change history, Persia. By the 6th century BCE, under the leadership of a brilliant and just ruler named Cyrus the Great, the Persian Empire stretched from the Indus Valley to the Aegean Sea. Cyrus wasn't just a conqueror, he was a liberator, and his policies would directly shape the fate of the Jewish people. Meanwhile, in the lands of Canaan, a small group of tribes was slowly forming a unique identity. Bound not by territory, but by a shared belief in one God, the Israelites would endure slavery in Egypt, wanderings in the desert, and the founding of a kingdom under Saul, David, and Solomon. The stage was set. On one side, Persia, rising fast, powerful and tolerant. On the other, Israel, fragile but determined, with prophets and kings and a temple in Jerusalem. And then came the moment that would bind their stories together, the Babylonian conquest. In 586 BCE, the Babylonians sacked Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, and exiled the Jewish elite to Babylon. It was one of the darkest moments in Jewish history, but it didn't last long, because just decades later, Cyrus the Great marched into Babylon, not with fire and fury, but with grace. He freed the Jewish captives and even funded the rebuilding of their temple. This single act earned him the eternal gratitude of the Jewish people, and a rare place in their scriptures as a foreign hero. Thus, the first bond between Iran and Israel was forged, not in war, but in mercy. Tonight, as you close your eyes and drift towards sleep, picture that moment. Exiled priests and elders, weary and hopeless, suddenly hearing the news that they can go home, that their God has not forgotten them, and that a Persian king, of all people, has become their unlikely savior. This is just the beginning. As the torches of Babylon flickered low and the memory of Cyrus still lingered in the hearts of the freed exiles, a new ruler rose to power in the Persian Empire, Darius the Great. Darius I, who came to the throne in 522 BCE, was not just a king. He was an organizer, a builder, and a man obsessed with order. He inherited a sprawling empire and transformed it into one of the most efficiently governed realms in history. Roads, taxes, coinage, and postal systems. Darius brought structure to what Cyrus had expanded. But he also brought something else, a continued kindness toward the Jews of Jerusalem. Under his reign, the rebuilding of the Second Temple, which had been stalled by political opposition and local sabotage, was resumed and finally completed. According to the biblical book of Ezra, it was Darius who reaffirmed Cyrus's original decree and ordered that the reconstruction be supported financially by the empire. Even sacrifices, it is said, were to be offered for the king and his family. This wasn't just diplomacy, it was policy. The Persian kings understood something powerful, that respect for local customs, religions, and leaders led to loyalty. And nowhere was that clearer than in the Judean province of Yahad. Imagine Jerusalem in those years, dusty, half-built, with rubble still being cleared from streets and prayers whispered over stones. Families returned from exile were rebuilding not just homes, but a way of life. The Second Temple, when completed in 516 BCE, became not just a place of worship, but a symbol of survival. And above them, on distant thrones in Persepolis and Susa, Persian kings watched a people reborn. But while things were quiet in Jerusalem, elsewhere, storm clouds gathered. Darius had his hands full. He crushed rebellions in Egypt and Babylon, reorganized the satrapies, provinces, and began preparing for war with the Greeks. His attempt to subjugate Greece culminated in the famous Battle of Marathon in 490 BCE, where the Athenians struck a shocking blow to Persian pride. Back in Judea, the Jewish people quietly continued their lives under Persian rule. They paid their taxes, observed their Sabbath, and remembered their strange, benevolent overlords to the east. It's fascinating to think that during one of the most intense geopolitical periods in ancient history, two of the Bible's most sacred structures were erected and maintained not by Israelite strength, but by Persian policy. So tonight, if your eyes are growing heavy and your breath slowing down, let your mind drift to those desert roads connecting Susa to Jerusalem. Think of scribes recording decrees in cuneiform, messengers galloping through arid plains, and temple priests preparing incense in a city rebuilt by a foreign empire. Next chapter, we'll meet a mysterious queen, a hidden plot, and a story that has echoed through Purim celebrations for over 2,000 years. Yes, Esther is coming. As we drift further into the woven tapestry of ancient ties between Iran and Israel, let's light a candle in the quiet halls of a Persian palace. The year is somewhere in the mid-5th century BCE. The great Persian Empire is still powerful, stretching from India to Ethiopia. And at its heart is a king named Xerxes I, called Ahasuerus in Hebrew texts. This chapter is not carved into temple stones or recorded in royal Persian inscriptions. Instead, it's whispered through scrolls, chanted in synagogues, and celebrated every year in a festival filled with costumes, joy, and remembrance, Purim. The tale we tell now is that of Esther, the Jewish orphan girl who became queen of Persia. According to the Book of Esther, Xerxes held a lavish feast, one so extravagant it lasted 180 days. Drunk on power and wine, he demanded that his queen, Vashti, present herself before the court. She refused. In her defiance, the seeds of Esther's story were sown. Vashti was dismissed, and a kingdom-wide search began for a new queen. Enter Hadassah, known to the Persians as Esther. She was raised by her cousin Mordecai and, when taken to the palace, kept her Jewish identity secret. Through grace, intelligence, and beauty, she won the king's favor and was crowned queen. But this fairy tale takes a dark turn. A high-ranking official named Haman rose in Xerxes' court. Ambitious and proud, he seethed when Mordecai refused to bow before him. And in retaliation, Haman did something chilling. He plotted genocide. He convinced the king to issue a decree to destroy all the Jews in the empire. In this chapter, we've crossed continents and centuries. We've seen empires fall to dust and revolts spark from the smallest sparks. We've watched as belief battled assimilation and identity stood firm against the tide of change. Let this chapter lull you into thought. Empires may seem eternal, but they crumble. Cultures may clash, but they shape one another. And amidst it all, ordinary people, farmers, priests, scribes, carry the weight of history in quiet, determined steps. Close your eyes and imagine the hills of Judea, echoing with the chant of rebels. Picture candlelight flickering against stone walls as a defiled temple is made holy again. And in the stillness, remember, history is never still. It is always moving, always whispering. Next, we descend into the Roman world, where prophecies stir and the story begins to tighten around one small corner of the Middle East, a place that will once again take center stage in the grand theater of history. Close your eyes and drift into the 1st century BCE. The air is thick with incense and anticipation. The hills of Judea are no longer ruled by rebellious priests or Persian kings, but by Rome, the new behemoth that casts its long shadow from Britannia to Babylon. Rome doesn't just conquer, it absorbs. It paves roads, collects taxes, installs puppet kings, and expects peace in return. Pax Romana, they call it. But for the people of Judea, peace is complicated. Enter Herod the Great. Half Jewish, fully political, Herod is a client king propped up by Roman power. He renovates the Second Temple into a wonder of the ancient world, but rules with cruelty and paranoia. He kills rivals. He kills family. And according to gospel tradition, he orders the slaughter of innocent infants out of fear of a prophesied Messiah. Speaking of messiahs, this is the age of prophets and promise. Roman oppression has sown seeds of unrest, and among the people of Judea, a longing blooms, a yearning for deliverance, for a savior. And then whispers spread through dusty streets and echo in candlelit synagogues. A teacher from Nazareth, named Yeshua, Jesus, begins preaching a radical message of love, repentance, and the kingdom of God. He performs miracles, draws crowds, and unsettles both religious authorities and Roman officials. Jesus' story, as told in the New Testament, ends in crucifixion, but not silence. His followers spread his teachings, first through Judea, then across the Roman Empire. Christianity is born, a faith rooted in Jewish prophecy, but destined to become something new, and often something deeply at odds with its parent faith. Back in Judea, tensions boil over. Rome's heavy-handed rule and the longing for independence ignite another fire. The First Jewish-Roman War, 66 to 73 CE. It ends with devastation. Jerusalem falls. The Second Temple is destroyed. 1 million lives are lost. The Sacred Heart of Judaism is reduced to rubble, and Jewish survivors scatter across the empire, launching the long and painful chapter known as the diaspora. But even amid this sorrow, memory endures. A single stone wall, the Western Wall, remains. And to this day, it stands as a symbol of loss, resilience, and hope. Meanwhile, Persia is not idle. Though Rome dominates the Mediterranean, the Parthian Empire rises in Iran, becoming a formidable rival to Roman power. A cold war simmers between East and West, while smaller nations and ancient faiths, Judaism among them, navigate the ever-shifting balance. This chapter in our story is one of destruction and revelation. Faith is tested, cities fall, but ideas, those are harder to destroy. The teachings of prophets, the visions of mystics, the prayers of a scattered people, they ripple forward, carried by memory and manuscript. Let this thought cradle you into stillness. Even when stones fall, stories endure. Even when cities burn, belief survives. Drift with the echoes of temple bells and Roman boots. Imagine the clash of civilizations, the grief of a displaced people, and the stubborn hope that refuses to die. History does not sleep, but it pauses, breathes, and begins again. Next, we rise into the fire of empires, the age of Byzantines and Sassanids, where both Iran and the Jewish faith find themselves at crossroads once more, straining beneath the weight of prophecy and power. Let the wind blow through the pages of time again, carrying us forward to the 3rd and 4th centuries CE. Rome is no longer the confident empire of Caesar and Augustus. It is crumbling, cracking from the inside, divided, beleaguered, and vulnerable. In its eastern provinces, another power rises, the Sassanid Empire of Persia, forged from the ashes of the Parthians and burning with fresh ambition. The Sassanids are more than warriors. They are zealots of Zoroastrianism, determined to restore Persian glory and purify the world of foreign corruption. Their kings wear crowns shaped like flames. Their priests tend eternal fires. Their capital, Ctesiphon, sits like a jewel along the Tigris, rivaling any Roman city in splendor. And across the mountains to the west, the Eastern Roman Empire, soon to be called Byzantium, claims the legacy of Rome. Christian now, imperial always, Byzantium is ruled from Constantinople, a city of marble and mosaics, built to rival the gods. Iran and Rome, now Sassanid and Byzantine, are again locked in a long, grinding conflict. It's a Cold War made hot by border raids, betrayals, and shifting alliances. These two superpowers will fight no fewer than 10 wars in 3 centuries, exhausting their armies, draining their treasuries, and redrawing maps again and again. But the battle is not just fought with swords. It's fought with gods. Byzantium champions Christianity, now the official religion of the empire after Constantine's conversion. The Sassanids, meanwhile, are defenders of the old Persian faith, Zoroastrianism. And caught between them, always, are the Jews. In Persia, Jews find a surprising level of tolerance. Under the Sassanids, Jewish academies thrive in Babylon. Scholars compile the Talmud. Rabbinic Judaism takes shape, turning exile into identity. Here, in this Persian soil, the seeds of modern Jewish thought begin to grow. Meanwhile, in Byzantium, things are more complicated. At first, Christians and Jews live side by side. But as Christianity gains power, the tone shifts. Emperors begin enacting restrictions. Synagogues are closed. Conversions are encouraged or forced. The idea of the Jews as a wandering, punished people starts to harden. For centuries, Jews in Persia pray for the return to Zion while living under Persian kings. And Jews in Byzantium pray for safety from Christian mobs while watching their ancestral faith become marginalized. And yet, life persists. The Silk Roads stretch from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. Merchants carry spices, silk, and stories. Philosophers debate destiny. Prophets dream of redemption. But the horizon darkens again. In the 6th century, the Byzantine, Sassanid wars grow more brutal. One of the bloodiest comes in 602 to 628 CE. Cities are sacked. Jerusalem is caught in the middle. In 614 CE, the Sassanids capture the Holy City with the help of Jewish allies who long for restoration. For a brief moment, it seems Jewish autonomy in Jerusalem might be restored. But it doesn't last. The Byzantines recapture the city. Revenge follows. Massacres stain the streets. Hopes are dashed. And then, just as both empires stagger, bloodied and spent, another force rises from the deserts of Arabia. A force that neither empire, neither religion, sees coming. But for now, rest in the stillness between empires. Imagine torchlit scrolls in Persian libraries. Hear the chants of Byzantine monks echoing in cold stone cathedrals. Picture a rabbi writing by candlelight, whispering the laws of exile into eternity. History breathes here, in the tension of rivals, the faith of the scattered, and the silence before the storm. Next, we awaken to the dawn of Islam, and everything changes. Hey there, still with me? Good. Because this chapter changes everything. You've been drifting through centuries of Persian and Roman intrigue, watching empires spar and collapse, religions rise and oppress. Now we stand on the edge of something seismic, something that will reshape the map, the faith, and the fate of both Iran and Israel. Enter Islam. Let's start in the vast, sun-scorched sands of 7th century Arabia. The year is roughly 610 CE. A merchant named Muhammad ibn Abdullah begins receiving revelations in a cave outside Mecca. He preaches that there is one God, Allah, and that justice, mercy, and submission to this divine will are the path forward. He calls it Islam. At first, Muhammad is mocked, resisted, even exiled. But gradually, his message spreads. Tribes unite under his banner. By the time of his death in 632 CE, much of the Arabian Peninsula is Muslim. Within a century, that message will stretch from Spain to India, and it strikes like lightning into a weakened world. Remember Byzantium and the Sassanids? They're exhausted from war. The Byzantines are still reeling from the loss and reconquest of Jerusalem. The Sassanids are politically unstable, rulers murdered, civil wars erupting. Into this vacuum, the armies of Islam charge forward with a momentum that feels unstoppable. In 636 CE, the Battle of Yarmouk sees the Muslim forces crush the Byzantines. In 637, they seized Ctesiphon, the crown jewel of Persia. By 651 CE, the Sassanid Empire is gone. Just like that, Persia, a civilization that once defied Rome, that crowned kings in fire, is under Muslim rule. But this is no simple conquest. The Persians do not disappear. Their culture, their language, their philosophy all endure, absorbed and reshaped within the Islamic world. The Persian heartland becomes part of the Abbasid Caliphate, one of the most intellectually vibrant Islamic empires in history. Persian scholars translate Greek texts, develop algebra, write epic poetry. And what of the Jews? Under early Islamic rule, Jews and Christians are granted dhimmi status, protected but second-class citizens. They pay a tax, jizya, in exchange for autonomy. In many cases, this treatment is far more tolerant than what Jews faced in Christian Europe. In Baghdad, under the Abbasids, Jewish academies flourish again. The Talmud continues to evolve. Trade opens new possibilities. Jewish thought mingles with Muslim philosophy, especially in places like Persia and Al-Andalus, Muslim Spain. But this harmony is not perfect or permanent. As dynasties rise and fall, tolerance fluctuates. Some caliphs embrace Jewish physicians, astronomers, and poets. Others enact harsh restrictions. The Crusades add another layer of violence, as Christian armies sweep through the region, killing Muslims and Jews alike in their zeal to reclaim the Holy Land. And through it all, Persian identity adapts. Though now officially Muslim, Persian thinkers often resist Arab domination culturally. They write in Farsi. They preserve pre-Islamic myths in works like Ferdowsi's Shahnameh. Iran begins to form its own distinct Islamic identity, rooted in Shi'ism. Yes, this is important. While most of the Muslim world embraces Sunni Islam, Iran gradually leans toward Shia Islam, especially after the rise of the Safavid dynasty in the 16th century. But even before that, the seeds are there, a theological tension that will one day shape modern geopolitics. Let's not rush too far ahead. For now, in this moment, the 7th through 10th centuries, we witness one of history's most sweeping transformations. Judaism survives in pockets and prayers. Persia survives through adaptation. And Islam, born in the deserts of Arabia, becomes the axis upon which this whole region now turns. Next, we follow the call of empires once more, the Crusaders, the Mongols, and the shifting powers of a region that refuses to stay still. History never sleeps. But if you do, may your dreams be filled with crescent moons, ancient scrolls, and the scent of desert winds beneath star-choked skies. Let's step into the chaos of the next chapter, one stained with blood, ambition, and the relentless clash of faiths. It's the late 11th century, and something seismic is stirring in Christian Europe. Word spreads of Muslim control over Jerusalem, of pilgrims turned away or attacked, of the Holy Sepulchre, believed to be the site of Christ's burial, under Islamic rule. Pope Urban II, in a fiery sermon at the Council of Clermont in 1095, calls for a holy war. The First Crusade is born. In 1099, Crusaders capture Jerusalem. The bloodshed is horrific. Muslim and Jewish inhabitants are massacred. A Christian kingdom is established, but it's fragile, constantly threatened by Muslim powers. For nearly 200 years, Crusader states cling to the Levant like weeds in a desert wind, often squabbling among themselves. And Jews, they are crushed in the crossfire. European Crusaders slaughter Jewish communities even before leaving Europe, blaming them for Christ's death. In the Holy Land, Jews face massacres, displacement, or forced conversions. Yet many endure, hiding, fleeing, or quietly returning when the violence fades. In Persia, meanwhile, a different storm brews. The Seljuk Turks, a Sunni Muslim dynasty, dominate much of Iran and parts of the Islamic world. They bring a revival of Sunni orthodoxy and support scholars and poets like Omar Khayyam. But their power wanes. Enter the Mongols. In the 13th century, Genghis Khan unleashes a tidal wave of conquest that sweeps across Asia. By the time his descendants reach the Middle East, the Mongols are a force of utter devastation. In 1258, they sack Baghdad, then the intellectual heart of the Islamic world. The libraries burn. The caliph is killed. The city is reduced to rubble. Iran suffers immensely. Cities are razed. Populations decimated. And yet, from this horror, resilience emerges. The Mongols eventually convert to Islam. In Persia, they establish the Ilkhanate, and under rulers like Ghazan Khan, a new flowering begins. Persian culture again proves indestructible, adapting, enduring, even influencing its conquerors. And what of the Jews under Mongol rule? Interestingly, the Mongols often favored religious tolerance. They had Buddhists, Christians, Muslims, and shamans among them. Jewish communities found a strange kind of safety, free from Islamic taxes, and sometimes even elevated as administrators or financiers. It's a moment of breath before the next plunge. Throughout this era, the Jewish longing for Zion persists. Despite expulsions and massacres, prayers for Jerusalem echo across Europe, Persia, and North Africa. A few daring souls return. The land is desolate, but sacred. In Safed and Jerusalem, small Jewish communities hang on. And in Iran, Jewish communities continue under varied rule. Seljuk, Mongol, Timurid. Sometimes they thrive, other times they're persecuted. Always, they adapt. Like water. This period, the Crusades, the Mongols, reminds us that empire is a storm. It destroys, yes, but it also reshapes. It exposes the cracks in the core. And through it all, the people, Persians, Jews, Arabs, hold fast to memory, to myth, to meaning. In the next chapter, we step into the age of Renaissance and religious reformation. But in this part of the world, another transformation is coming, a Persian one, a Shia one that will make Iran unmistakably Iran. For now, may your dreams be filled with shimmering domes, desert winds, and the soft rustle of pages preserved against all odds. Hey, still awake? Good, because now we arrive at a turning point not just for Iran, but for the entire identity of the region. The dust of the Mongols has barely settled. The Crusader kingdoms are fading into myth, and yet something powerful, something uniquely Persian, is stirring. The year is 1501. A boy of just 14 is crowned Shah. His name? Ismailide. His empire? The Safavid dynasty. And with this, Iran's identity as a Shia Muslim stronghold is forged in fire, poetry, and blood. Before the Safavids, Iran was a cultural heavyweight but religiously diverse, mostly Sunni with pockets of Shia believers. But Shah Ismail had a vision: to unite the region under 12er, a distinct sect that reveres a line of 12 imams descended from Ali, the cousin of Prophet Muhammad. This wasn't a gentle transition. Conversion was often forced. Sunni clerics were purged, books burned, dissenters silenced. But what emerged was something remarkable: a unified Iranian identity. Persian language, Shia theology, and royal authority were woven into one magnificent, sometimes menacing, tapestry. And the Safavids weren't just theologians, they were builders. Isfahan, their capital, became a jewel of Islamic architecture. The Sham Mosque, with its shimmering blue tiles, still stands as a whispering echo of their glory. Caravanserais, bazaars, and gardens dotted the landscape. Art and calligraphy flourished. And yes, so did politics and paranoia. The Safavids ruled for over 2 centuries, and during this time, Iran became a distinct entity, culturally Persian, religiously Shia, and politically formidable. But no empire exists in a vacuum. Enter the Ottomans. To Iran's west, the Sunni Ottoman Empire stood tall. And guess what? The Safavids and Ottomans did not get along. The two powers clashed repeatedly, particularly over control of the Caucasus and Mesopotamia. These weren't just territorial disputes. They were ideological wars: Sunni versus Shia, East versus West, tradition versus rebellion. Meanwhile, Jewish communities within Iran watched, endured, and adapted. Some faced harsh restrictions: distinctive clothing, curfews, special taxes. At times, they were forcibly relocated or accused of ritual crimes. Yet, as always, many found ways to contribute and survive. In cities like Hamadan, Isfahan, and Shiraz, Jewish merchants, physicians, and poets quietly lived, traded, and wrote. And what of the land of Israel? During this period, it was under Ottoman control. The once glorious city of Jerusalem had become a backwater, but still sacred. Jewish families continued to live there, often poor and marginalized, but present. Others lived in Tiberias, Saif, and Hebron. In fact, Saif became a center of Jewish mysticism, the birthplace of modern Kabbalah. Rabbi Isaac Luria, one of Judaism's greatest mystics, lived and taught there in the 16th century, dreaming of redemption. So now let's take stock. Iran has become a Shia powerhouse, distinct and defiant. The Jewish diaspora is scattered, some in relative peace, others in quiet suffering. The land of Israel is sacred, sleepy, and still caught in the gravitational pull of distant empires. This chapter in our story reminds us how identity is not just inherited, it is created, sometimes violently, sometimes beautifully, always deliberately. And as the Safavids eventually decline and the Qajars rise, a new set of questions begins to emerge. What happens when modernity comes knocking? What happens when Europe, curious, imperial, and often careless, begins to intervene? Stay with me, because the next chapter, it will take us into the smoke and steam of the 19th century, where everything changes again. Until then, drift gently through the tiled courtyards of Isfahan. Hear the soft call to prayer over the rooftops. And know that even in the quiet, history is always speaking. The Second World War left the globe in ruins, and yet it also redrew the world's lines of power, of ideology, of survival. In the middle of this global chessboard, Iran and Israel found themselves navigating the treacherous currents of Cold War politics, newly forming identities, and volatile regional dynamics. Iran, under Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, had emerged from the war as a monarchy propped up by foreign interests. In 1953, a defining moment occurred. The CIA and British intelligence orchestrated a coup that overthrew Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, who had dared to nationalize Iran's oil. The Shah, who had fled, returned to the throne. This was not just a change in leadership. It was a loud declaration to the Iranian people that their resources, their destiny, could be manipulated from outside. This coup would cast a long shadow. The Shah, now firmly in place, leaned heavily on American support. U.S. aid poured into the country. American advisors shaped military and economic policy. Western culture flooded Tehran, bringing with it a modernity that dazzled some and alienated many. The divide between the secular elite and the conservative majority widened. Israel, meanwhile, was a young state with old wounds. Having survived its War of Independence in 1948, it was still absorbing waves of immigrants, Jews from Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. Each wave added to Israel's complexity and diversity, but also to its social and economic challenges. The new state had also inherited its own existential conflict, the Palestinian refugee crisis. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians had fled or been expelled during the 1948 war, and their displacement became a central issue in Arab-Israeli tensions. Yet despite this turbulent environment, an unlikely alliance began to form in the shadows. In the 1950s and 1960s, Iran and Israel, both non-Arab, both at odds with their neighbors, quietly developed ties. It was a relationship of necessity, born not of ideology, but of strategy. Iran saw Israel as a potential partner in a region increasingly hostile to its monarchy. Israel saw Iran as a rare friendly face in a hostile neighborhood. Trade agreements were signed. Israeli military advisors trained Iranian forces. Intelligence agencies exchanged information. And while the two nations never formalized full diplomatic relations, their cooperation was deep and pragmatic. This back-channel alliance existed even as the broader Middle East convulsed. In 1956, Israel, Britain, and France launched a joint attack on Egypt during the Suez Crisis. The U.S. forced them to withdraw, but the event demonstrated Israel's willingness to act decisively. In 1967, the Six-Day War saw Israel seize the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, the Golan Heights from Syria, and the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan. The outcome shocked the world. Israel's military success altered the balance of power and intensified the resentment of Arab states. For Iran, the war reinforced the value of its quiet ties with Israel, but it also forced the Shah to walk a tightrope. Publicly, Iran supported Arab causes. Privately, it maintained its cooperation with Israel. At home, the Shah's grip tightened. The Savak, his secret police, became notorious for surveillance, torture, and suppression. Political opposition was crushed, and yet, under the surface, resistance was simmering. Among the Shah's fiercest critics was an exiled cleric, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, whose ideas would one day transform the nation. While Iran grappled with internal dissent, Israel faced its own shifting realities. The aftermath of the 1967 war brought territorial gains, but also moral and political questions. The occupation of Palestinian territories would come to define much of Israel's domestic and international policy for decades to come. In the 1970s, as oil prices rose and Iran's revenues surged, the Shah embarked on an ambitious modernization program. Skyscrapers rose, universities expanded, and Tehran buzzed with a cosmopolitan energy. Yet the more he pushed toward westernization, the more he alienated large segments of Iranian society. Religious leaders decried the loss of Islamic values. Rural communities saw little of the newfound wealth. Intellectuals, students, and workers began to organize in defiance of the regime. The disconnect was growing, and revolution was in the air. As for Israel, the Yom Kippur War of 1973 delivered a shockwave. Attacked by Egypt and Syria on the holiest day of the Jewish calendar, Israel suffered heavy initial losses. Though it eventually repelled the assault, the psychological impact was profound. The war shattered the image of Israeli invincibility and led to a reckoning with national vulnerabilities. That same year, The oil-producing Arab nations used their petroleum exports as a weapon. In response to Western support for Israel during the war, OPEC launched an oil embargo. Prices soared. The global economy reeled. For Iran, an OPEC member, the embargo meant unprecedented profits. The Shah's vision of a powerful, modern Iran seemed within reach. But with wealth came greater scrutiny, both from the West and from his own people. The late 1970s were a pressure cooker. In Tehran, protests multiplied. Demonstrators demanded freedom, justice, and an end to tyranny. The Shah, increasingly out of touch, responded with violence, and then hesitation. Neither worked. In the shadows, Khomeini's influence grew. His cassette sermons, smuggled into Iran, offered an alternative vision, an Islamic republic governed by clerics, free from Western domination and corruption. In 1979, the dam broke. The Shah fled. Khomeini returned. The Islamic Revolution would not just change Iran, it would reshape the entire Middle East. The secret friendship with Israel was severed overnight. The Israeli embassy in Tehran was closed and handed over to the Palestinians. Anti-Zionist slogans filled the streets. Iran was no longer a monarchy. It was a theocracy with a global mission. And in the wings, Israel watched. A new chapter was about to begin. The Islamic Revolution of 1979 did not merely change the structure of power in Iran. It detonated the very core of its national identity. The overthrow of the Shah was not a simple regime change. It was a sweeping rejection of monarchy, Western influence, and perceived moral decay. It was also the beginning of a new ideological age, one where religion and revolution would fuse into a force that reshaped not just Iran, but the world. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, returning from exile, was no ordinary political leader. He was a symbol, a living martyr to some, a menacing figure to others. As supreme leader of the new Islamic Republic, he wielded immense religious and political power. The monarchy was dissolved. Iran's constitution was rewritten. A theocratic regime took hold, one that claimed to derive its authority from divine will, not electoral legitimacy or dynastic inheritance. And one of its earliest targets? Israel. The secret cooperation between Iran and Israel that had flourished under the Shah was denounced with righteous fury. Overnight, Israel went from silent partner to sworn enemy. Tehran's Israeli embassy became the Palestinian embassy. Maps were redrawn. Flags were burned. Speeches thundered with chants of death to Israel. But the roots of this hostility went deeper than politics. For the new Iranian leadership, opposing Israel was both a moral stance and a geopolitical strategy. It cast Israel as a colonial, oppressive force, an outpost of Western imperialism in the Islamic world. This narrative resonated deeply with many in the Middle East who had long seen the Palestinian plight as a symbol of broader injustice. Meanwhile, Israel, already isolated in the region, watched with concern. The fall of the Shah meant the loss of a crucial strategic partner. More than that, it marked the rise of a powerful, ideologically driven adversary that pledged to resist Israel's very existence. In those early revolutionary years, Iran exported its message across borders. It supported Shia militias, particularly in Lebanon, where a civil war had turned the country into a battleground for regional and global powers. Out of this chaos emerged Hezbollah, a Shia militant group heavily backed by Iran. Formed in the early 1980s, Hezbollah became both a resistance movement against Israeli occupation in southern Lebanon and a powerful political force within Lebanon itself. Iran's support was not just financial, it was ideological. Hezbollah became the spearhead of Iran's regional vision: resistance, self-determination, and unwavering opposition to Israel. This new reality fed into an already smoldering fire. In 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon. Its goal was to crush the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, which had launched attacks from Lebanese soil. The war was brutal, bloody, and politically divisive. Israeli forces reached Beirut, but instead of resolving the conflict, the invasion deepened it. The Sabra and Shatila massacre, where hundreds of Palestinian refugees were killed by a Christian militia allied with Israel, shocked the world. Israeli public opinion turned. Protests erupted in Tel Aviv. The war, meant to ensure security, instead left scars on Lebanon, on Israel, and on the regional psyche. Back in Iran, the revolution was solidifying its grip. Khomeini's regime cracked down on dissent, consolidated power, and tightened its control over every facet of Iranian life. The U.S., once Iran's staunchest ally, became its great Satan. Then came another global shock, the Iran-Iraq War. In 1980, Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded Iran, hoping to take advantage of the chaos following the revolution. What followed was one of the longest and bloodiest conflicts of the 20th century, an 8-year war marked by trench warfare, chemical weapons, and the deaths of hundreds of thousands. Israel, despite its enmity with the Islamic Republic, feared Saddam more than Khomeini. Quietly, discreetly, Israel supplied Iran with some arms and intelligence, part of what would later be exposed in the infamous Iran-Contra affair. The U.S., meanwhile, supported Iraq. This strange triangle of shifting alliances showed how pragmatic and paradoxical Middle Eastern politics could be. Ideologies clashed on the surface, but beneath them, strategic calculations often ruled. The war devastated Iran. Cities were flattened. Generations were scarred. But it also fortified the Islamic Republic's legitimacy. The regime framed the conflict as a sacred defense, a jihad against aggression. Martyrdom was glorified. The culture of resistance deepened. By the late 1980s, the war had ended in a bitter stalemate. Khomeini, old and ailing, passed away in 1989. His death marked the end of an era, but not of the revolution. His successor, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, inherited a more institutionalized Islamic Republic. The passions of revolution gave way to the mechanisms of governance. Iran emerged battered but intact, determined to project its influence. And Israel, now facing the rise of Islamic movements on multiple fronts, from Hezbollah in Lebanon to Hamas in Gaza, was adjusting to a new regional order. At the same time, a dramatic shift was occurring in the Palestinian territories. The First Intifada, an uprising against Israeli occupation, erupted in 1987. It was a grassroots movement, stone-throwing youth, civil disobedience, and widespread unrest. The world watched. Cameras captured the asymmetry of the conflict. International pressure mounted. Iran, though geographically distant, threw its support behind the Palestinian cause. It provided funds, rhetoric, and political backing. Israel, now more entrenched in the territories it had seized in 1967, faced growing isolation. By the close of the 1980s, the foundations for future confrontations were firmly in place. Iran had transformed itself into a revolutionary state with a global mission. Israel had solidified its hold over occupied lands, facing both external enemies and internal debates. The hopes of cooperation that once flickered under the Shah were now buried beneath layers of ideology, history, and blood. And the next decades would only intensify this divide, cementing the eternal conflict, one whispered through prayers, shouted in protests, and written into the very architecture of two nations moving further apart. Let's move forward, deeper into this story. As the 1990s dawned, a glimmer of something different shimmered on the horizon, something that, for a brief and breathless moment, looked like peace. For Israel and the Palestinians, the Oslo Accords promised a roadmap to coexistence. In a world just emerging from the Cold War, diplomacy seemed fashionable again. Hope was back in style. But peace in the Middle East is never simple, and it rarely lasts. The Oslo Accords, signed in 1993 on the White House lawn, were the result of secret negotiations in Norway between Israeli and Palestinian representatives. Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and Palestine Liberation Organization (PLO) Chairman Yasser Arafat shook hands under the watchful gaze of President Bill Clinton. The moment was electric. Two sworn enemies smiling in the sunlight, pens in hand, history being written. The agreement outlined mutual recognition. Israel acknowledged the PLO as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. The PLO recognized Israel's right to exist in peace. The plan also set up the Palestinian Authority, a governing body for limited self-rule in parts of the West Bank and Gaza. It wasn't perfect. It was tentative, incomplete, and fraught with vagueness. But it was a start. For many Israelis, it was a leap of faith. For Palestinians, it was a compromise wrapped in disappointment, recognizing Israel without receiving full statehood or an end to occupation. But there was motion, at least. The region held its breath. Iran, however, was not cheering. The Islamic Republic viewed the Oslo process as a betrayal. To Tehran, it was a sellout of Palestinian rights, an American-engineered charade designed to entrench Israeli dominance. Iran denounced the PLO's recognition of Israel and began bolstering factions that rejected Oslo outright, Hamas in Gaza and Islamic Jihad among them. This opposition wasn't just rhetorical. Iran funneled weapons, money, and training to these groups. It positioned itself as the champion of true resistance, unwilling to bargain with what it saw as an illegitimate occupier. Meanwhile, within Israel, not everyone supported the accords either. The country was deeply divided. While some citizens saw Rabin as a courageous peacemaker, others viewed him as a traitor who was surrendering Jewish land. That anger came to a tragic head on November 4, 1995, when Rabin was assassinated by an Israeli extremist at a peace rally in Tel Aviv. The bullet didn't just kill the man, it wounded the peace process irreparably. The years that followed saw rising violence. Suicide bombings rocked Israeli cities. Airstrikes and military incursions devastated Palestinian communities. Oslo limped on, but the trust was gone. On the global stage, Iran's influence grew. Its support for armed groups across the region expanded, especially as the U.S. began tightening its grip on the Middle East post 9/11. In the 2000s, Iran became a central figure in what many called the Axis of Resistance, an alliance that included Syria, Hezbollah, and various Palestinian factions, all united in their rejection of Israel and U.S. influence. And within Israel, politics shifted. The peace camp shrank. Hardliners gained ground. In 2000, the Second Intifada broke out after peace talks collapsed. This uprising was bloodier and more militarized than the first. The violence was relentless, and the dream of a two-state solution began to fade. By this point, Israel had begun constructing a separation barrier, part wall, part fence, cutting deep into the West Bank. The government called it a security measure. Palestinians called it a land grab. Amid this, Iran doubled down. Under President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, elected in 2005, the rhetoric sharpened. Ahmadinejad famously called for Israel to be wiped off the map, a statement that sent shockwaves through international circles and reinforced Israel's worst fears about Iran's intentions. It was during this time that Iran's nuclear ambitions began to dominate headlines. Israel, with its own undeclared nuclear arsenal, saw a nuclear-armed Iran as an existential threat. Tehran insisted its nuclear program was for peaceful purposes, energy, and medical research. But the lack of transparency, coupled with fiery anti-Israel rhetoric, led to growing international concern. The standoff deepened. Israel lobbied for harsh sanctions. The U.S. and European allies responded. Iran's economy suffered, yet Iran remained defiant, spinning centrifuges in underground facilities, building out its nuclear capabilities while denying any intention of building a bomb. The tension became a slow burn, simmering, ever-present, occasionally boiling over in covert strikes, cyber attacks, and mysterious assassinations of Iranian nuclear scientists. And in the shadows of this grand geopolitical chessboard, the ordinary people on both sides suffered quietly. Palestinian children grew up amid rubble. Israeli teenagers served in mandatory military service, facing threats on every border. Iranian citizens navigated economic hardship, political repression, and international isolation. Yet through it all, the threads of hope never entirely vanished. There were still activists who believed in peace, families who reached across divides, scholars, artists, and dreamers who imagined a different future. But the machinery of power, the institutions of fear, retaliation, and control, marched on. By the end of the 2000s, a new Middle East was taking shape. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan had shifted regional dynamics. Iran's influence had grown, stretching from Tehran to Beirut. Israel had fortified itself militarily and diplomatically, even as the peace process lay in tatters. And the question that haunted both nations remained unresolved. Could two nations born of trauma, sustained by memory, and armed to the teeth ever truly coexist? That question would linger into the next decade and be tested by the next wave of revolutions, wars, and reckonings still to come. Let's continue. As the 2010s approached, a familiar tension hung in the air, but so too did the scent of change. The Middle East was about to be shaken to its core, not by war between nations, but by uprisings from within. The Arab Spring would send shockwaves across the region, upending regimes and redrawing alliances. And in the chaos, both Iran and Israel would find themselves recalibrating their place in an increasingly volatile landscape. It began in Tunisia with a fruit vendor named Mohamed Bouazizi. His act of self-immolation in protest of police corruption and harassment sparked nationwide demonstrations, which soon spread to Egypt, Libya, Syria, Yemen, and beyond. These weren't just political protests. They were explosions of decades-long frustration with authoritarianism, economic hardship, and lack of freedom. Israel watched the unfolding revolutions with caution. Stability in neighboring regimes had long served its strategic interests, and the prospect of unpredictable leadership changes, or worse, power vacuums filled by extremists, was deeply unsettling. For Iran, the uprisings were a double-edged sword. On one hand, the fall of pro-Western autocrats seemed like a victory for anti-imperialism. On the other, popular uprisings were an existential threat to the Islamic Republic's tightly controlled regime. Then came Syria. What began as a peaceful protest against President Bashar al-Assad's rule devolved into a brutal civil war. Iran, a longtime ally of Assad, committed heavily to preserving his regime. It sent military advisors, funds, and weapons, and later, fighters from Hezbollah and even its own revolutionary guards. Syria became a proxy battleground for larger regional rivalries. Israel, for its part, stayed officially neutral in the Syrian conflict, but quietly launched dozens of airstrikes targeting Iranian arms transfers and military positions in Syria. The goal was to prevent Iran from establishing a permanent military foothold on Israel's northern border. Thus, while not officially at war, Israel and Iran were once again in a state of simmering confrontation, one of rockets, drones, and red lines drawn in desert sands. Meanwhile, Iran's nuclear program returned to the global spotlight. After years of negotiations, threats, and sanctions, the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, was signed. Brokered between Iran and 6 world powers, including the U.S., the deal lifted crippling economic sanctions on Iran in exchange for strict limits on its nuclear activities. Iran agreed to reduce its uranium stockpile, cut its number of centrifuges, and allow rigorous international inspections. Israel was not pleased. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called the deal a historic mistake. He argued it merely delayed Iran's nuclear ambitions while flooding Tehran with cash it could use to arm Hezbollah, Hamas, and other hostile actors. In a rare move, he even addressed the U.S. Congress in 2015, without the president's invitation, to urge rejection of the deal. But the JCPOA went into effect. For a brief period, tensions seemed to ease. Iran's economy showed signs of recovery. Regional diplomacy shifted. But in 2018, under President Donald Trump, the U.S. unilaterally withdrew from the agreement, reimposing sanctions and initiating a campaign of maximum pressure. Iran responded by slowly resuming its nuclear activities. The spiral of provocation resumed. Cyber attacks, military skirmishes, and tit-for-tat escalations followed. The most dramatic moment came in January 2020, when a U.S. drone strike killed General Qasem Soleimani, the powerful head of Iran's Quds force, at Baghdad airport. The assassination sent shockwaves through Iran and the wider region. Crowds of mourners filled the streets. Iranian missiles were fired at U.S. bases in Iraq. The world held its breath. Throughout all of this, Israel continued its campaign of shadow warfare, targeting Iranian facilities, assassinating nuclear scientists, and launching cyber attacks like the now infamous Stuxnet virus. Iran responded in kind, allegedly attacking Israeli shipping and launching cyber offensives of its own. But while state actors played their dangerous games, ordinary people in both Iran and Israel navigated very different realities. In Iran, years of sanctions and economic mismanagement had taken a toll. Inflation soared, unemployment rose, and the cost of living grew unbearable for many. Periodic protests erupted across cities, met with swift crackdowns by security forces. Theocratic rule remained firm, but the populace was restless. In Israel, domestic politics became increasingly polarized. A series of elections produced unstable coalitions and growing divisions over issues ranging from judicial reform to relations with Palestinians. At the same time, Israel expanded diplomatic ties with the Arab world, culminating in the 2020 Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords, brokered by the U.S., normalized relations between Israel and several Arab states, including the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan. It was a seismic shift. For decades, most Arab states had refused to establish formal ties with Israel until a Palestinian state was created. But geopolitical realities, chief among them a shared concern about Iran's regional influence, led to a new calculus. Peace, or at least cooperation, became transactional. Iran was furious. It condemned the agreements as betrayals of the Palestinian cause. In response, it ramped up support for proxy forces and increased its hostile rhetoric. In some ways, the Abraham Accords didn't just isolate Iran, they hardened its stance. And then, in 2021, conflict erupted again in Gaza. A series of events, including tensions in East Jerusalem and the eviction of Palestinian families, sparked 11 days of rocket fire and airstrikes. Israel targeted Hamas infrastructure. Hamas launched missiles deep into Israeli territory. Once again, civilians bore the brunt. Children died. Buildings collapsed. Trauma deepened. The cycle repeated. Yet amidst the darkness, new movements began to sprout. In Israel, some youth began pushing for more inclusive dialogue. Within Iran, women took to the streets demanding greater freedoms, symbolized by the 2022 protests sparked by the death of Mahsa Amini, a young woman detained for allegedly violating dress codes. Those protests, though met with brutal suppression, echoed globally. They weren't just about clothing. They were about choice, dignity, and a yearning for something more. And though separate from the Iran-Israel conflict, they spoke to a deeper truth: the desire of ordinary people to reclaim their voice from the machinery of state power. As the decade drew to a close, both Iran and Israel stood at crossroads. One remained an isolated, theocratic power with regional ambitions and a restive population. The other, a high-tech democracy grappling with internal tensions, unresolved conflict, and a shifting global order. And between them, the same ancient fears and ambitions endured, wrapped in new names, new alliances, and new risks. But even in the face of darkness, the human spirit stirred. A violin played amid the ruins in Gaza. A father in Tehran taught his daughter about hope. A rabbi and an imam shared coffee in Jerusalem. The echoes of the past rippled into the future. And the story was far from over. The sun rises on a region ever restless. As the 2020s unfold, the story of Iran and Israel continues, entwined, entangled, and intensified. And with every drone strike, summit handshake, coded threat, and peace accord, one truth becomes ever clearer. History doesn't just echo in this part of the world, it roars. By 2023, the region seemed caught in a paradox. Unprecedented normalization and unprecedented danger. Iran, battered by sanctions and internal unrest, had accelerated its nuclear program once again. Inspectors warned its uranium enrichment was edging dangerously close to weapons-grade levels. The regime insisted it was for peaceful energy. But no one, not the US, not the IAEA, and certainly not Israel, was reassured. Israel's intelligence apparatus worked around the clock. Surveillance satellites, cyber tools, and on-the-ground operatives fed data to a security state always on high alert. In this shadow war, knowledge was power, and power was protection. The stakes were existential. And still, as tensions soared, diplomacy whispered. Back-channel negotiations flickered between Tehran, Washington, and European capitals. Leaks hinted at possible frameworks, partial freezes, economic sweeteners, prisoner exchanges. But with hardliners entrenched on both sides and trust nearly non-existent, each step forward came with 3 steps back. Meanwhile, in Tel Aviv and Tehran, life pulsed on. In Israel, protests surged against proposed judicial reforms, drawing hundreds of thousands into the streets. It wasn't about Iran or Palestinians, it was about democracy. In Iran, similar masses had marched, only to be met with tear gas, arrests, and silence. Yet the spark hadn't died. Women burned hijabs in defiance. Students rallied. Artists found courage in subtext. Truth refused to stay buried. Then came a turning point no one saw coming. In early 2024, a cyber attack crippled Iran's Natanz nuclear facility. It was swift, sophisticated, and devastating. Fingers pointed instantly at Israel. Jerusalem denied involvement. Tehran promised revenge. But this was no longer the tit-for-tat of old. This time, the game felt closer to the edge. The next weeks brought drone attacks in Syria, an Israeli oil tanker hit in the Gulf, and a mysterious explosion at an Iranian missile site. The choreography of escalation was chilling. And yet, even here, amid suspicion and sabotage, hope clung to the margins. At the United Nations, a historic session took place. For the first time in decades, Iranian and Israeli delegates sat in the same room during an unofficial roundtable on regional security. It wasn't diplomacy. It wasn't even negotiation. But it was presence. The world noticed. Meanwhile, technology began to reshape the narrative. AI surveillance, quantum encryption, and cyber warfare became the new frontiers of conflict, but also of peace. Virtual summits allowed civil society groups from Iran and Israel to speak, to share stories, to see each other not as enemies, but as people. On a live stream watched by thousands, a young Iranian filmmaker from Shiraz and an Israeli poet from Haifa read works to each other. One wrote of wind over desert ruins. The other replied with waves against Mediterranean cliffs. The audience wept. Yet back in the corridors of power, hard truths remained. Iran continued funding proxies, from Hezbollah in Lebanon to militias in Iraq and Syria. Israel continued expanding settlements, clashing with Palestinians, and deepening ties with Sunni Arab regimes wary of Iranian ambitions. It was an intricate dance of cooperation and confrontation. The Abraham Accords deepened. Saudi Arabia edged closer to normalization with Israel, despite its public rhetoric. The Gulf states increasingly positioned themselves as power brokers, balancing ties with Washington, Tel Aviv, Tehran, and Beijing. Yes, China. The global chessboard shifted. In a stunning move, Beijing hosted secret talks between Iranian and Saudi officials, resulting in a restoration of diplomatic ties. It was a geopolitical coup and a signal that U.S. dominance in Middle Eastern diplomacy was no longer guaranteed. Israel watched warily. Iran maneuvered confidently. The balance of power was no longer bilateral. It was multipolar, fluid, and unpredictable. And still, the people dreamed. In Qom, a theology student questioned old dogmas. In Eilat, an ex-soldier painted murals of peace. In London, exiled Iranians met Israelis in quiet cafes. Exile became a meeting place, not a wall. And in homes, across both nations, families sat down to dinner. They told old stories, laughed, argued, grieved, because behind the headlines, the missiles, the speeches, there were always people. Humans with hearts not hardened by policy, but softened by experience. The struggle between Iran and Israel is not only a clash of ideologies or a relic of ancient prophecy. It's a mirror to the human condition. Power and fear, pride and grief, faith and doubt. And it's far from over. As the decade stretches forward, the future remains uncertain. But maybe, just maybe, it's being shaped not only by generals and politicians, but by poets, mothers, hackers, dancers, teachers, and dreamers. And maybe the true revolution, the one no one can bomb or hack, is the one that happens in hearts and minds, one whisper at a time. So, as we close this journey through millennia of history, as you drift into sleep or contemplation, remember, some stories don't end. They just wait for you to listen again. And somewhere between the shadows of ancient temples and the glow of modern screens, the next chapter is already beginning. If you've made it this far, thank you for staying with me through the echoes of empire, faith, conflict, and hope. History like this isn't just about kings and treaties. It's about you. It's about us. It's about remembering what was, so we can better understand what is, and gently imagine what could be. If you enjoyed this slow, thoughtful journey through the story of Iran and Israel, I'd love for you to let me know. Maybe leave a comment sharing where in the world you're listening from, or which moment in the story stayed with you the most. And if you'd like more journeys like this, quiet stories told with care, please consider subscribing. Every listen, every like, every gentle hello helps keep this space alive for others looking to fall asleep to something deeper than silence. Until next time, sleep well, dream kindly, and remember, the past is never gone. It's just waiting for someone to listen.